I was 14 years old when they married me off to a man who weighed 300 pounds and spoke a language I didn't understand. And honey, what I found out about him's years later, well, it changed everything I thought I knew about evil walking among us in plain sight. My name's Amira. I'm 76 now, and most folks around here in Millbrook know me as that quiet lady who runs the spice shop downtown. The one who makes those little prayer rugs for the mosque and bakes honey cakes for the church bake sale. They see me feeding stray cats behind the grocery store. Always got a kind word and $1 for anyone who needs it. That's who I am now. But Lord have mercy, that ain't who I started out to be. See, there's a story I've been carrying around in my chest for over 60 years, pressing down on my ribs like a stone that just won't settle. It's about how a scared little girl from a family that didn't have 2 nickels to rub together got handed over to a man who turned out to be running something so twisted, so calculated, that even now when I think about it, my hands start shaking like autumn leaves. I've been listening to the radio all these years, you know, learning how to put words together proper-like, hearing how other folks tell their stories. The preacher at church, he always said words have power, that speaking truth can set you free. Well, I reckon it's time I found out if that's so. I'm gonna tell you everything, how it started, how it nearly broke me, and how I finally found the strength to break it instead. This here story, it ain't just mine. It's for every woman who ever felt trapped, every girl who got told her life was already decided for her, every soul who thought they were too small to fight back against something bigger than themselves. If you're willing to walk with me through this memory, to sit a spell while I unpack all these years of silence, then maybe my words can find their way to exactly the hearts that need to hear them most. Back in 1962, when the world was still black and white on most folks' television sets, and girls like me were expected to know their place without question, I was living in a little Dust Bowl town in East Texas, where the summer heat could fry an egg on the sidewalk and the winter wind cut through you like a rusty knife. My daddy had died the year before. Heart gave out right there in the cotton field, dropped like a sack of grain under that merciless August sun, and Mama was left with 4 mouths to feed and nothing but prayers to put food on the table. We were what folks politely called struggling. But really we were drowning in a sea of unpaid bills and empty cupboards. Mama would water down the milk until it looked like clouds, stretch the soup with whatever vegetables the neighbors might spare, and I watched her grow thinner and more desperate with each passing month. She'd sit on the porch after us kids went to bed, rocking in that old chair that squeaked like a hurt animal, and I could hear her whispering to God in Arabic, the language her own mama had taught her before she learned to speak American. That's when Hassan al-Rashid came to town. He arrived in late September driving a big black Cadillac that gleamed like oil in the sunshine, dust trailing behind him like he was some kind of prophet, coming to deliver us from our suffering. Word spread faster than wildfire that there was a wealthy Muslim man looking to marry within the faith. And honey, when you're poor and desperate, wealthy sounds like a promise from heaven itself. Hassan was 40 years old, thick around the middle like a man who'd never known hunger, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked upon. He spoke English with an accent that made every word sound important, and he wore suits that probably cost more than our house was worth. When he sat down in our parlor that first day, the old couch groaned under his weight, and I remember thinking how small the whole world suddenly seemed in the presence of his bigness. Mama served him tea in our good china, the set that had been her wedding gift, the one we only used for funerals and Christmas, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as she explained our situation. I was 14, she told him, old enough to be a proper wife, raised in the faith, trained in keeping house. She spoke about me like I was livestock being presented for sale. And maybe that's exactly what I was. Hassan nodded and asked to see me. I came forward in my best dress, the blue one with the tiny flowers that Mama had sewn by hand. And he looked me over like a man appraising a horse he might buy. He asked if I could cook, if I could clean, if I was obedient. I answered yes to everything, because that's what I'd been taught to do. But inside my chest, something felt wrong, like when you're walking through the woods and you hear a stick break behind you. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. She'll do, he said finally, and pulled out a roll of money thicker than my wrist. The marriage can be arranged for next month. I remember the relief that washed over Mama's face, how her shoulders dropped like she'd been carrying the weight of the world, and someone had finally offered to help. I remember thinking that maybe this was how prayers got answered sometimes. Not with angels and golden light, but with strange men in expensive cars offering solutions that tasted like salvation and fear all mixed together. But what I didn't know, what none of us could have guessed, was that Hassan al-Rashid wasn't just looking for a wife. He was looking for something else entirely, something that would take me years to understand and even longer to escape from. And that roll of money he'd given Mama, well, it wasn't a bride price at all. It was the first payment in a transaction so much darker than anything my innocent 14-year-old mind could have imagined. The papers were signed, the imam was contacted, and just like that, my childhood was sold right out from under me like furniture being auctioned off to pay debts. But I swear to you, on everything holy and true, what I discovered about that man years later, it would have made even the devil himself think twice about shaking hands with Hassan al-Rashid. October came in like a thief, stealing away what was left of my girlhood with every passing day that brought the wedding closer. Hassan started visiting our house regular-like, always bringing gifts. Bolts of fabric that felt like silk water between my fingers. Little bottles of perfume that smelled like flowers I'd never seen. Candies wrapped in papers so pretty, I was almost afraid to tear them open. Mama's eyes would light up every time she saw that black Cadillac pulling into our dirt driveway, and I learned to put on a smile that felt like wearing shoes that didn't fit. He would sit in our parlor and talk about his business, how he owned shops that sold beautiful carpets and spices from faraway places, how he had connections with important people, how he was building something bigger than what most folks in our little town could even imagine. His voice was smooth as honey when he spoke, but there was something underneath it that reminded me of the way water sounds when it's running over rocks in a creek bed, pleasant on the surface, but you know there's something harder and colder beneath. I started noticing things about him during those visits. How his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, but not in the way a man looks at a woman he's smitten with. More like the way our old tomcat used to watch the mice in the barn, patient and calculating. How he never really listened when I tried to talk about the books I'd been reading, or the songs I liked on the radio. But he paid real close attention when Mama mentioned other families in town who were struggling, who had daughters around my age. There was this one afternoon in late October when he brought me a music box. Little thing with a ballerina that spun around to a tune I didn't recognize, foreign-sounding, all minor keys that made something in my chest feel heavy. I was turning it over in my hands, watching that tiny dancer spin and spin, when Hassan leaned forward and said something that stuck to my memory like burrs on a wool sweater. "You know, Amira," he said, his voice dropping low like he was sharing a secret. "In my country, marriages are about more than just two people. They're about families helping families, communities taking care of communities. A good wife doesn't just serve her husband. She serves a greater purpose." I remember looking up at him, trying to understand what he meant, and seeing something in his dark eyes that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was like looking into a well at night. You know there's water down there, but you can't see the bottom, and you're not sure you want to. What kind of purpose? I asked, and immediately wished I hadn't, because the smile that spread across his face was the kind that never quite reached the eyes. You'll understand soon enough, he said, patting my hand with fingers that felt damp and cold. Some things are better learned than explained. After he left that day, I found myself standing in our kitchen, still holding that music box, watching through the window as his Cadillac disappeared down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. Mama was humming while she counted the money he'd given her, enough to pay the electric bill and buy groceries for the next 2 weeks. But all I could think about was how that little ballerina kept spinning even after the music stopped, like she was trapped in a dance she couldn't escape from. That night I had the first of what would become many sleepless nights, lying in my narrow bed and listening to the October wind rattling our windows like fingers trying to get inside. I kept thinking about what Hassan had said, about serving a greater purpose, and wondering why the thought of it made my stomach twist up like a dish rag being wrung out. I didn't know it then, but I was already being sized up for something much bigger and darker than just being a wife to one man. I was being evaluated as a piece in a puzzle I couldn't even see yet, a puzzle that stretched far beyond our little Texas town and involved more people than I could have ever imagined. The wedding was set for November 15th, just 3 weeks away, and with each passing day, I felt like I was walking deeper into a forest where the trees grew closer together and the light got dimmer and dimmer. I told myself it was just wedding nerves, that every bride must feel this way. But deep down in my bones, I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know how wrong it really was. I didn't know that Hassan al-Rashid had been watching our family for months before he ever knocked on our door, or that ours wasn't the first desperate household he'd visited, with his expensive suits and his roll of money and his promises of security. I had no way of knowing that what felt like salvation was actually the first step into a trap so carefully constructed that by the time I realized I was caught, the door had already slammed shut behind me. November 15th, 1962. My wedding day dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low like dirty sheets on a clothesline. I remember standing in front of the cracked mirror in my bedroom, wearing a white dress that Mama had borrowed from the preacher's wife, and feeling like I was looking at a stranger. The girl in that reflection had eyes too old for her face, like she'd already seen things she shouldn't have, even though the worst was still coming. The ceremony was small, just immediate family, the Imam Hassan had brought from Dallas, and a few neighbors who came more out of curiosity than celebration. Hassan wore a black suit that made him look even bigger than usual, and when he slipped that thin gold band on my finger, his hands were sweating despite the November chill. I remember thinking how the ring felt like a shackle, cold and foreign against my skin. But it was what happened after the ceremony that changed everything, that made me realize I wasn't just married. I was owned. Hassan drove me to a house on the outskirts of town, a place I'd never seen before, even though I'd lived in that county my whole life. It was bigger than anything I'd ever imagined living in, with thick carpets that swallowed up the sound of footsteps and heavy curtains that blocked out most of the daylight, even in the middle of the afternoon. The air inside smelled like incense, and something else I couldn't name, something that made my throat feel tight. "This is your home now," Hassan said. But the way he said "your" made it clear that nothing in that house would ever really belong to me. He showed me to a room upstairs. My room, he called it. But when I tried the door handle later, I found out it locked from the outside. That first night, I lay in a bed that felt like a cloud but might as well have been a prison cot, listening to Hassan moving around downstairs, talking on the telephone in a language I didn't understand. His voice would rise and fall, sometimes angry, sometimes pleased, but always discussing something that sounded like business, important business, the kind that happens in shadows and whispers. It was during my second week in that house that I started noticing the visitors. They would come at odd hours, always men, always speaking in that same foreign language Hassan used on the phone. Some were young, barely older than me. Others had gray in their beards and walked with the careful steps of men carrying heavy secrets. They would sit in Hassan's study with the door closed, and I could hear the murmur of their voices through the walls, punctuated by the scratch of pens on paper and the soft thud of money being counted. Hassan had told me I wasn't to leave the house without his permission, wasn't to answer the door, wasn't to speak to anyone who might call. "You're still learning," he said. "Still adjusting to your new life. It's better if you stay quiet and observe for now." But there was something in his tone that made it clear these weren't suggestions. They were orders. I started spending my days like a ghost haunting my own life, moving through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home, surrounded by beautiful things I wasn't allowed to touch. Hassan would leave early in the morning and not return until late at night. And during those long, empty hours, I began to piece together things that didn't make sense, like the letters that came addressed to names I'd never heard Hassan mention. Women's names, all of them foreign-sounding, all of them arriving with money inside the envelopes. Like the photographs I found tucked inside a book in the library, pictures of young girls, all of them dark-haired and serious-looking, all of them about my age or younger. But it was what I overheard during one of those late-night meetings that finally opened my eyes to the truth. I had gotten up to use the bathroom, padding barefoot down the hallway in my nightgown, when I heard Hassan's voice coming from the study below. The door must have been cracked open because his words were clearer than usual, and what I heard made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "The Richardson girl is ready," he was saying to whoever was with him. 15 years old, good family, desperate for money. The father lost his job at the mill last month. "I can have her here by Christmas. And the payment?" another voice asked. "Same as always. 2,000 for the arrangement, another 3 when she's delivered. The family gets 500 to seal the deal." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart beating so loud I was sure they could hear it downstairs. They were talking about buying another girl, another me, and suddenly, all those strange visitors, all those letters with money, all those photographs, it all made terrible, perfect sense. Hassan wasn't just a husband, he was a collector. And I wasn't his wife, I was his inventory. The next morning, Hassan looked at me across the breakfast table with those calculating eyes, and I swear he could see the knowledge written on my face like words in a book. I tried to act normal, tried to smile and nod when he talked about his plans for the day, but inside I was screaming. "You seem different today," he said, cutting into his eggs with surgical precision. "Troubled about something?" "No, sir," I lied, but my voice sounded thin and scared, even to my own ears. He studied me for a long moment, then smiled that smile that never reached his eyes. "Good. Because troubled wives make for complications. And I don't like complications in my business." That's when I knew for certain that I wasn't just trapped in a marriage. I was trapped in something much bigger and darker, something that involved other girls, other families, other transactions, hidden beneath the respectable surface of carpet shops and spice importers. I was 14 years old, locked in a house with a man who traded in human beings like they were livestock, and I had no idea how to get out. But worse than that, I was starting to realize that getting out might not be enough. Because if Hassan al-Rashid was doing this to me, how many others was he doing it to? And what happened to the girls who came before me? By December, the Texas winter had settled into our bones, like an unwelcome guest, and I had learned to move through Hassan's house like a shadow, quiet and invisible, always listening, always watching. I had become a student of his routines, memorizing the sound of his footsteps, the cadence of his voice when he was pleased versus when he was angry. The way the floorboards creaked under his weight when he paced the study during those late-night phone calls. It was on a particularly bitter night, when the wind was howling around the house like something wild and desperate, that I finally understood the full scope of what I had stumbled into. Hassan had been drinking, something he rarely did. But the whiskey made him careless, made his voice carry further than usual. I was supposed to be asleep, but I had gotten into the habit of lying awake listening, trying to piece together the puzzle of my new life one overheard conversation at a time. That night he was talking to someone about a shipment, that's what he called it, a shipment that was arriving from overseas. Young women, he said, who needed placement with American families. The language he used was all business terms, clean and sanitized. But underneath those careful words was something that made my stomach turn over like spoiled milk. The authorities are getting more suspicious, Hassan was saying, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey. We need to be more careful about the documentation. Make sure everything looks legitimate. Marriage certificates, family connections, proper paperwork. What about the local girls? The other voice asked. I recognized it now as belonging to a thin man with nervous eyes who had been visiting more frequently. Those are easier. Desperate families, girls with no prospects, parents who think they're giving their daughters a better life. They don't ask questions when you wave enough money in front of them. I pressed my ear harder against the heating vent in my bedroom floor, hardly daring to breathe. The Peterson girl's father came by the shop yesterday, Hassan continued. 3 kids to feed, wife sick with consumption, about to lose the farm. His daughter just turned 16. Pretty little thing. I told him I might know of a suitable arrangement. That's when something inside me broke wide open like a dam bursting. The Peterson girl. I knew her. Sarah Peterson, with her corn silk hair and shy smile, who sang in the church choir and helped her mama with the younger kids. I had gone to school with her before I got married, had shared lunches with her, when neither of us had much to bring from home. She was sweet and trusting, and had never hurt a soul in her life. And Hassan was going to buy her just like he had bought me. The rage that filled me up was unlike anything I had ever felt before. Hot and clean and bright as lightning. It burned away the fear that had been living in my chest for months. Burned away the helplessness and the confusion and the terrible, suffocating feeling of being trapped. For the first time since my wedding day, I felt like myself again. I made a decision that night that changed everything. The next morning, when Hassan left for his shop, I did something I had never done before. I walked out the front door and kept walking. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the doorknob. But I forced myself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, even though every instinct was screaming at me to go back, to be quiet, to be good. I walked the 3 miles into town in my thin coat and worn-out shoes, my breath making little clouds in the cold air, and I went straight to the one place I thought might help. The police station. Sheriff Morrison was a friend of my daddy's, had known me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. When I walked into his office looking like a scarecrow blown in by the wind, he took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. Amira, child, what are you doing out in this cold? Does your husband know where you are? I opened my mouth to tell him everything, about the late-night meetings, about the photographs, about Sarah Peterson and the shipments from overseas, and the way Hassan talked about girls like they were cattle to be traded. I was going to pour it all out like water from a broken pitcher. But then Sheriff Morrison said something that stopped me cold. I hope you're not here to cause any trouble for Mr. Al-Rashid. He's been real good to this community, donating to the church, supporting local businesses. Man like that, well, we don't want to go making unfounded accusations, do we? The way he said it, with that warning tone underneath the friendly words, made me realize that Hassan's influence reached further than I had imagined. The sheriff wasn't going to help me. Nobody was going to help me. I mumbled something about getting lost, about just needing directions home, and Sheriff Morrison drove me back to Hassan's house in his patrol car, chatting pleasantly about the weather and the upcoming Christmas pageant at the church, like he was delivering a lost puppy instead of returning a desperate girl to her captor. Hassan was waiting in the driveway when we pulled up, his face a mask of concern that didn't quite hide the fury in his eyes. "Thank you so much, Sheriff," he said, helping me out of the car with hands that gripped my arm just a little too tight. My poor wife, she's still adjusting to married life, gets confused sometimes. I'll make sure she has everything she needs at home. That night, for the first time since our wedding, Hassan came to my room after locking the door from the outside. He didn't hurt me. Not physically, but he sat in the chair by my bed and spoke in a voice so quiet and controlled that it was more terrifying than shouting would have been. "I know what you heard last night," he said, "and I know what you tried to do today. But here's what you need to understand. Little wife, you belong to me now, just like everything else in this house. And if you ever try to leave again, if you ever try to interfere with my business again, I will make sure that something very unfortunate happens to your mother and your little brothers back in that falling down house on Maple Street." He leaned forward then, close enough that I could smell the whiskey still on his breath. "Do we understand each other?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he smiled that terrible smile. "Good. Because tomorrow I'm going to pay a visit to the Peterson family, and you're going to come with me, and you're going to smile, and be pleasant, and help me convince them that I'm offering their daughter the opportunity of a lifetime. And if you do that, if you're a good girl, and help me with my work, then your family back home will continue to be safe and sound." As he stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "You see, Amira, you're not just my wife anymore. You're my partner, and partners help each other succeed, don't they?" After he left, I lay in that bed staring at the ceiling and realized that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I wasn't just a victim anymore. Hassan was going to make me complicit in his crimes. He was going to use me to help him trap other girls, to help him destroy other families. And the most terrifying part was that I was starting to understand that saying no might not be an option. But what Hassan didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that forcing me to become his accomplice would end up being the biggest mistake he ever made. Because if he wanted me to get close to his operation, if he wanted me to see how it all worked from the inside, well, that would give me something he never intended. It would give me the knowledge I needed to bring the whole thing down. The Peterson visit happened 3 days before Christmas, and I remember every detail of that afternoon, like it was burned into my memory with a branding iron. Hassan made me dress in my finest clothes, a navy blue dress with pearl buttons that made me look older, more respectable. And he coached me in the car about what to say and what not to say. "You tell them how happy you are," he instructed, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. "You tell them how I've given you a life of comfort and security. You smile when Mrs. Peterson asks about your future children, and you let her think that marriage to a successful businessman is every girl's dream." The Peterson farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, paint peeling from the siding like old scabs, the front porch sagging under the weight of too many hard winters. When we knocked, Mrs. Peterson answered the door with flour on her hands and hope in her tired eyes. The kind of hope that comes from being so desperate you'll believe in miracles. Sarah was in the kitchen helping with the bread, her blonde hair pinned back with bobby pins, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt. When she saw me, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Amira, I haven't seen you since your wedding. You look so different." I did look different. Older, sadder, like a woman who had learned things no 16-year-old should know. But I smiled and hugged her like we were still the schoolgirls we used to be, all while my insides were twisting with the knowledge of why we were really there. Hassan worked his magic on the Peterson family like a snake charmer playing a flute. He talked about his successful business, his connections in the city, his desire to help worthy families during difficult times. He mentioned almost casually that he knew of a wealthy businessman in Dallas who was looking for a suitable wife, someone young, virtuous, raised with proper values. "The gentleman in question," Hassan said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that seemed too clean for a working man, "is quite prosperous. Import business. Very respectable. He's been waiting for the right girl. Someone who understands the value of family, of tradition." I watched Mr. Peterson's weathered face as Hassan spoke, saw the way his eyes flickered toward the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, toward his wife's worn-out shoes, toward the empty shelves in the pantry. I saw the exact moment when desperation overrode caution. "What kind of arrangement are we talking about?" Mr. Peterson asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the hunger in his voice. "A generous dowry, of course, enough to secure your family's future, to make sure your other children have opportunities." Hassan's voice was smooth as oil. "And naturally, your daughter would be well cared for. Want for nothing." Mrs. Peterson looked at Sarah with eyes that were already grieving, already saying goodbye. "What do you think, honey? Would you like to meet this gentleman?" Sarah glanced at me, looking for guidance, for some sign of what she should do. This was my moment. This was when I was supposed to smile and nod and tell her how wonderful my life had become, how marriage to one of Hassan's associates would be like stepping into a fairy tale. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I knocked over my coffee cup. It was an accident. At least, that's what it looked like. Hot coffee splashed across the table, soaking into those unpaid bills, dripping onto the floor. Mrs. Peterson jumped up with a rag, fussing and apologizing, and in the confusion I leaned close to Sarah and whispered just 4 words that I prayed she would understand. "Don't trust him. Run." Sarah's eyes went wide, but she was smart enough not to say anything. Smart enough to just nod and help clean up the mess, while Hassan watched me with the expression of a man who was beginning to suspect his trained dog might have learned to bite. The visit ended without any firm commitments. Hassan made his excuses about needing time to arrange a proper introduction, promised to return after the new year to discuss details, but I could see the disappointment in Mr. Peterson's face, the way his shoulders slumped as our car pulled away from his failing farm. On the drive home, Hassan didn't say a word until we were almost back to the house. Then, without warning, he pulled over to the side of the road and turned to look at me with eyes like black ice. "That was clumsy of you," he said quietly. "Spilling coffee like that. Almost like you did it on purpose." "It was an accident," I lied, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. "Was it?" He reached over and touched my face, almost gently. But there was nothing gentle about the way his fingers pressed against my cheek. "Because if I thought you were trying to sabotage my business, if I thought you were trying to warn people away from opportunities that could benefit everyone involved, well, that would be very disappointing." He let his hand drop to my throat, not squeezing, just resting there like a promise. "You remember what I told you about your family, don't you, Amira? About how important it is that everyone stays safe and happy." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Good, because I'd hate for your little brothers to have any accidents. Children can be so careless around farm equipment, around wells, around busy roads. Terrible things happen to careless children." When we got home, Hassan locked me in my room, and I didn't see him again for 3 days. But I could hear him on the phone, making other arrangements, talking to other desperate families. And I knew that my small act of rebellion had only delayed the inevitable, not stopped it. But something else had happened during those 3 days of solitude, something that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. A letter had arrived for Hassan, slipped under the door while he was making his rounds. When I found it the next morning, I almost put it back where it belonged, almost minded my own business like a good wife should. But the return address stopped me cold. It was from someone named Fatima Khalil in Dallas, and written across the bottom in small, careful handwriting were the words, "Regarding the Women's Assistance Program." Women's Assistance Program. Not business correspondence. Not shipping manifests or carpet orders. Something that sounded like help. Against every instinct for self-preservation I had left, I opened that letter and read words that made my heart race like a bird trying to escape a cage. Words about safe houses and legal aid and women who had escaped situations just like mine. Words about someone who understood, someone who could help. And at the bottom, in that same careful handwriting, "If you are reading this and you need help, there is a way out. You are not alone." For the first time since my wedding day, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed. Hope. January 1963 came in cold and bitter, with ice storms that turned the whole world into something sharp and dangerous. Hassan had been watching me closer since the Peterson visit, like a cat watching a mouse hole, waiting for me to make another wrong move. But what he didn't know was that Fatima's letter had lit a fire in me that no amount of threats could put out. I started being more careful, more clever. I learned to move through the house like smoke, to listen at doors without making the floorboards creak, to memorize every conversation and every visitor with the precision of someone whose life depended on remembering details. And maybe it did. The breakthrough came in February, during one of those late-night meetings that had become as regular as clockwork. Hassan was entertaining two men I'd never seen before. Older fellows with expensive coats and nervous energy. The kind who kept checking their watches and looking over their shoulders like they expected trouble to walk through the door any minute. I had gotten better at positioning myself where I could hear without being seen, and what I overheard that night made my blood run cold. They weren't just talking about individual girls anymore. They were talking about a pipeline. That's the word they used. Like they were discussing oil or water instead of human beings. A pipeline that brought young women from overseas, girls who spoke no English and had no family in America. Girls who disappeared into marriages that weren't really marriages at all. "The ship arrives next Thursday," one of the men was saying. 12 of them, all between 14 and 18. Good families back home, told their daughters were coming to America for education and opportunities. "Documentation?" Hassan asked. "Clean. Marriage certificates already prepared. Families already selected. The buyers have been screened, deposits paid." Buyers? They said it so casually, like they were talking about livestock at auction. But it was what came next that made me realize just how deep and wide this thing really was. "The Chicago operation wants to expand into Kansas City," the second man said. "They're asking if we can supply the Midwest route. More demand than we can handle right now." Chicago. Kansas City. This wasn't just Hassan operating out of our little Texas town. This was a network that stretched across states, maybe across the whole country. And somewhere in all of this were girls who had trusted the wrong people, families who thought they were giving their daughters better lives, young women who had no idea they were being sold like property. I pressed my ear harder against the heating vent, trying to catch every word, every name, every detail that might be important later. That's when I heard something that made my heart stop beating for a full second. "What about the local wife?" one of them asked. "She's been here, 3 months now? Is she reliable?" "Reliable enough," Hassan replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "She tried to cause some trouble early on, but she's learned her place, and she's been useful for the recruitment side. American families trust her more than they trust me." "You sure she won't talk?" "She won't talk. I've made sure she understands the consequences of talking." Then Hassan said something that made me feel like I was falling into a deep, dark hole with no bottom. Besides, she's already helped with 3 acquisitions. Makes her complicit. Even if she wanted to go to the authorities, who would believe her? And if they did believe her, she'd be in just as much trouble as the rest of us. 3 acquisitions, 3 girls. And somehow, without fully realizing it, I had helped Hassan trap them. The Peterson girl, Sarah, had been the first, despite my whispered warning, despite my spilled coffee. Her family's desperation had won out in the end. Hassan had returned in January with a different story, a different buyer. And this time, I hadn't been there to interfere. Sarah was gone now, married to a man in Oklahoma who paid Hassan $5,000 for a 16-year-old bride who thought she was getting a chance at a better life. The second had been Maria Santos, whose family ran the little grocery store on the Mexican side of town. Hassan had presented himself as a successful businessman, looking for a wife who could help him with his Spanish-speaking customers. Maria spoke 3 languages and had dreams of going to college. Now she was living in a house in New Mexico with a man who beat her when she tried to use the telephone. The third was Ruth Miller, whose father had lost his job at the railroad and was about to lose the family farm. Hassan convinced them that his business associate in Arkansas needed a proper wife to help him entertain clients, that Ruth's education and good manners would be valuable assets. Ruth had been gone for 2 weeks now, and every night I wondered if she was lying in a bed somewhere, staring at the ceiling and wondering how her life had gone so wrong, so fast. 3 girls, 3 families, 3 young women whose futures had been sold out from under them, and I had been there for every transaction, smiling and nodding and playing the part of the happy wife who could vouch for Hassan's character. I made it to the bathroom just in time to vomit up everything in my stomach, retching until there was nothing left but bile and guilt and the terrible understanding that I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an accomplice, but as I sat on that cold bathroom floor, shaking and crying and hating myself, something else began to grow alongside the guilt, something harder and sharper and more dangerous than anything I had ever felt before. Rage. Pure, clean rage at Hassan, at the men who came to our house to buy and sell human beings, at a world that let this happen to girls like me, like Sarah, like Maria, like Ruth. Rage at my own helplessness, at my own fear, at the way I had let myself be used as bait to trap other innocent souls. And underneath the rage, growing stronger every day, was a determination that scared me with its intensity. I was going to stop this. Somehow, some way, I was going to find a way to save the girls who came after us. I was going to make Hassan pay for what he had done, what he was still doing. But first, I had to contact Fatima Khalil. I had to find out if that letter was real, if there really was someone out there who could help. Because if I was going to take on something this big, this dangerous, I couldn't do it alone. The question was how to reach out without Hassan knowing, how to make contact without signing my own death warrant. The answer came to me 3 days later, when Hassan announced he was going out of town for a week to handle some business in Houston. A week alone in the house with access to the phone, with time to plan and think and maybe, just maybe, to start fighting back. I didn't know it then, but that phone call I was planning to make would set in motion events that would change everything. Not just for me, but for every girl Hassan had trapped, every family he had deceived, every person who had ever profited from the kind of evil that hides behind respectable business cards and charitable donations. The war was about to begin, and I was finally ready to pick up my weapons. March came in like Judgment Day, all thunder and lightning that seemed to shake the very foundations of Hassan's house. He had been gone to Houston for 6 days, and during those 6 precious days of freedom, I had done something that would either save me or destroy me completely. I had called Fatima Khalil. My hands were shaking so hard when I dialed that number that I could barely hold the receiver. and my voice came out like a whisper when she answered. But the moment I heard her speak, calm and sure and full of understanding, I knew that letter hadn't been some cruel joke. This woman was real and she was willing to help. Fatima told me things that made my head spin, about other women who had escaped situations like mine, about federal agents who were investigating networks of human trafficking, about safe houses where girls could disappear until it was safe to come forward. She told me that Hassan's operation was bigger than I had imagined, that it reached into cities I had never heard of, that there were people in Washington who wanted very badly to shut it down. But most importantly, she told me that I could be the key to stopping it all. "You're on the inside," she said, her voice crackling through the long-distance connection. "You see everything, hear everything, if you're brave enough to help us gather evidence, if you're willing to document what you witness. We can build a case that will put Hassan and his associates away forever." I wanted to say yes immediately. Wanted to pour out everything I knew right there over the telephone. But Fatima was smart, cautious. She explained how dangerous it would be, how careful we would have to be, how one wrong move could get me killed. Or worse, could get other people killed. We made a plan. I would write down everything I could remember about Hassan's business. Names, dates, amounts of money, details about the girls who had been sold. I would hide these notes where Hassan would never think to look, and when the time was right, Fatima would help me get the information to the right people. But as I hung up that phone, I felt something that had been building inside me for months finally reach its breaking point. It wasn't just fear anymore, or anger, or even determination. It was something much more dangerous than any of those things. It was certainty. Certainty that I was going to take Hassan down, no matter what it cost me. Certainty that every girl he had sold, every family he had destroyed, every young woman who was probably locked in a room somewhere just like I had been, they all deserved justice. And if I was the only one who could give it to them, then that's what I was going to do. Hassan returned from Houston on a Sunday morning, bringing with him news that made my blood freeze in my veins. He had arranged for another shipment, this one bigger than any before. 20 girls, he said. All young, all desperate, all perfectly suited for the American families who had already paid their deposits. But there was something different about Hassan when he came back from that trip. Something harder, more suspicious. He watched me with eyes that seemed to see right through my skin to the thoughts underneath. And when he spoke to me, his voice carried the weight of unspoken threats. "You've been very quiet while I was away," he said that first night, sitting across from me at the dinner table like a judge preparing to pass sentence. Very well behaved. I kept my face neutral, my voice steady. I had no reason to be otherwise. He smiled that terrible smile, the one that never reached his eyes. "No, I suppose you didn't." But I could tell he didn't believe me, could tell that something had shifted in the balance between us, that the careful control he had maintained over me was starting to crack around the edges, and that made him dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. April brought with it a suffocating heat that seemed to press down on everything like God's own judgment, and with that heat came a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Hassan had been planning something big. I could feel it in the way he moved through the house, in the nervous energy that crackled around him like electricity before a storm. The phone calls had increased, coming at all hours of the day and night. Men with urgent voices speaking in languages I was beginning to recognize but still couldn't understand. Money changed hands more frequently. Thick envelopes passed between sweating palms in the dim light of Hassan's study. Something was building toward a crescendo, and I was terrified of what that music might sound like when it finally reached its peak. Then Hassan told me we were taking a trip. "Pack your things," he said one morning over breakfast, his voice carrying that tone that meant no questions would be tolerated. "We are going to Dallas for a few days." I have some business to attend to, and I think it's time you met some of the other wives. Other wives? The words hit me like ice water. I wasn't the only one. There were other women like me. Other girls who had been bought and sold and turned into accomplices in this nightmare. The thought of meeting them, of looking into eyes that might mirror my own trapped desperation, made something inside my chest feel like it was tearing in half. But I also realized this might be the opportunity I had been waiting for. If I was going to Dallas, if I was going to be around other parts of Hassan's operation, I might be able to gather the kind of evidence that Fatima had told me about. I might be able to see the full scope of what we were fighting against. The drive to Dallas took 6 hours through countryside that looked like it was dying of thirst, past farmhouses that sagged under the weight of broken dreams and abandoned hopes. Hassan drove in silence mostly, occasionally speaking into a portable telephone that seemed like something from a science fiction movie. Each conversation was brief, coded, but I caught enough words to understand that we were heading toward something significant. The house in Dallas was bigger than Hassan's place in our little Texas town, fancier, with gates and security cameras that made it look more like a fortress than a home. When we pulled up the circular driveway, I saw other cars parked outside, expensive ones with license plates from different states. "Remember," Hassan said as he turned off the engine, "you are here to observe and learn. You speak when spoken to, you smile when it's appropriate, and you never ever forget that everything you see and hear today is family business." Family business. As if buying and selling human beings was something that happened at Sunday dinner, something normal families discussed over coffee and dessert. But as we walked up those front steps, my hand tucked into the crook of Hassan's arm like a proper wife, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. I was going to see everything, remember everything, document everything. And then I was going to burn Hassan's whole operation to the ground. The question wasn't whether I had the courage to do it anymore. The question was whether I would survive long enough to get the chance, because something told me that once I walked through those doors, once I saw whatever Hassan wanted me to see, there would be no going back. No pretending I was just an innocent girl who had gotten caught up in something beyond her understanding. After today, I would either be his partner in crime, or I would be his enemy. And enemies of Hassan al-Rashid had a way of disappearing. Walking through those doors in Dallas was like stepping into the belly of a beast I had only imagined in my worst nightmares. The house was filled with people, men in expensive suits conducting business over crystal glasses of whiskey, women who moved like ghosts through rooms that smelled of money and secrets, and scattered throughout like broken dolls were girls who couldn't have been much older than I was. But it was what I saw in the basement that finally broke something inside me that could never be fixed. Hassan led me down a set of stairs that creaked under our feet, past walls lined with photographs of young women, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each picture labeled with a name, an age, and a price. At the bottom of those stairs was a room that looked like an office, complete with filing cabinets and ledger books and maps covered in red pins, marking locations across the country. "This is the heart of our operation," Hassan said, spreading his arms wide like a proud father showing off his children's accomplishments. "Every transaction, every placement, every success story, it all flows through this room. Success stories. That's what he called them. As if ruining lives was something to celebrate. But what made my knees buckle, what sent me grabbing for the nearest chair to keep from falling, was the wall of filing cabinets labeled by state. Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, on and on, row after row of metal drawers containing the documented destruction of young women's futures. Hassan pulled out a folder marked with my name and opened it in front of me like he was sharing a family photo album. Inside were copies of my marriage certificate, photographs of me from before our wedding, and detailed notes about my family's financial situation, my mother's health, my brother's school records, everything about my life reduced to data points that could be bought and sold. "You see, Amira," Hassan said, his voice smooth as oil on water, "you were never random. We researched you for months before I ever knocked on your family's door. Your father's death, your mother's desperation, your family's reputation in the community. All of it made you the perfect candidate." He flipped to another section of the folder, and I saw photocopies of bank records showing payments made to families across Texas. The Peterson family, the Santos family, the Miller family, all the girls I had helped him acquire, all the families I had helped him deceive. "And you've been more valuable than I ever imagined," he continued, closing the folder with a soft snap. "American families trust you. You give legitimacy to our arrangements. You make what we do seem normal, respectable, even charitable." That's when I understood with crystal clarity that this wasn't just about showing me his operation. This was about making me an official partner. This was about ensuring my complicity by making me see exactly how deep the rabbit hole went, how impossible it would be to expose him without destroying myself in the process. "There's a new shipment arriving tomorrow night," Hassan said, moving to stand behind my chair with hands that rested on my shoulders like weights. 23 girls from overseas, all with families here ready to receive them. And I want you to help me with the processing. Processing? Like they were packages instead of people. "What kind of processing?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. Hassan's smile was the most frightening thing I had ever seen in my life, the kind that makes sure they never try to leave. But what Hassan didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed in his wildest imagination, was that Fatima Khalil wasn't just a social worker helping desperate women escape bad situations. She was a federal agent, FBI, working undercover for 3 years to infiltrate the exact network that Hassan had just shown me with such pride. Every conversation we'd had, every detail I'd shared with her during those terrifying phone calls, had been building toward this moment. And I wasn't just a frightened girl stumbling into a way to fight back. I was the key witness they had been waiting for. The realization hit me like lightning when I saw her walk into that basement room in Dallas, wearing a dress I recognized from one of Hassan's photographs on the wall. She had been posing as one of the success stories for months, living in a house in Oklahoma, playing the part of a grateful foreign bride, while documenting every transaction, every name, every detail of the operation. When her eyes met mine across that room full of filing cabinets and human misery, I saw the truth written there as clear as scripture. This had all been planned. My phone call hadn't been a desperate reach into darkness. It had been an answer to prayers I didn't even know had been prayed. Hassan was still talking, still explaining how the processing worked, still outlining my new role in his empire of broken dreams, when the front door of that Dallas house exploded inward, and armed federal agents poured through like an avenging flood. The next few hours passed in a blur of handcuffs and shouting, and Hassan's face transforming from predatory confidence to the pale shock of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble into dust. They arrested 17 people that night, seized thousands of documents, and began the process of unraveling a network that stretched from Texas to Chicago, to cities I had never heard of. But the most beautiful moment, the one that still brings tears to my eyes all these years later, came when Fatima knelt beside me in that basement and said the words I had been waiting my whole life to hear. "You're safe now, Amira. It's over. You're going home." Home. Not to Hassan's house of secrets and shadows, but to my mama's little place on Maple Street, where my brothers were waiting with hugs that lasted for hours and questions I would spend years learning how to answer. The trials took 3 years. Hassan got life in prison, along with most of his associates. The network was dismantled, the overseas connections severed, the pipeline that had destroyed so many lives finally shut down for good. And through it all, I testified. I remembered. I spoke truth into courtrooms, where justice finally had a chance to show its face. Some of the girls were found and returned to their families. Others, like Sarah Peterson and Maria Santos and Ruth Miller, took longer to locate, longer to heal. But they were alive, and they were free. Not all of them wanted to go back to their old lives. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. But they had choices again. And sometimes that's all a soul really needs to start over. Today I'm 76 years old, and I run that little spice shop downtown where the whole thing started. But it's different now. It's a legitimate business. And more than that, it's a sanctuary. Young women who are scared, who are trapped, who don't know where to turn, they know they can find help here. The back room that used to store inventory is now an office where trained counselors help girls escape situations that might destroy them. I never married again, though I had plenty of opportunities. Love felt like a luxury I couldn't afford after everything I'd seen, everything I'd lived through. But I found something better than romantic love. I found purpose. I found a way to turn the worst thing that ever happened to me into something that could save other people from the same fate. Every year on November 15th, my first wedding anniversary, I light a candle for all the girls who didn't make it out, all the women who disappeared into lives they never chose, all the families who are still searching for daughters who vanished into systems designed to erase them completely. And every year I remember that even in the darkest places, even when evil seems too big and too powerful to fight, there are people working in the shadows to bring light back into the world. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to reach out your hand and trust that someone will take it. If my story has moved you, if something in these words has touched a place in your heart that needed touching, then maybe you can help my voice travel a little further. Maybe you can share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's fighting their own battles against things that seem too big to overcome. Because the truth is, we're all stronger than we think we are, and we're never as alone as we fear. I'm still here in that little Texas town, still making spice blends and listening to stories, and believing with everything in me that courage is contagious. Tell me, where are you watching this from? What corner of the world are my words reaching today? I'd love to know that somewhere out there, someone heard this story and decided that their own fight was worth fighting, their own voice was worth raising, their own life was worth saving. And if you think other souls need to hear this, if you believe in the power of one voice to change everything, then help this old woman's words find their way to the hearts that need them most. Subscribe to hear more stories, because, honey, I've got plenty more where this one came from, and every single one of them ends the same way, with hope winning over fear, with light pushing back the darkness, with ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they finally decide they've had enough. That's the real truth about courage. It doesn't come all at once like lightning. It builds up slow, like water behind a dam, until one day you realize you're strong enough to let it all come pouring out. And when it does, when that flood of determination finally breaks free, there's nothing in this world that can stand against it. Nothing at all.